Ian Cunningham vows that the Falcons will never have just 5 draft picks again, and will break down why his draft philosophy is going to get Atlanta back on track.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Locked On Falcons, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the #1 sports podcast network in the Northern Hemisphere. And I'm your humble host, Aaron Freeman, been covering the Atlanta Falcons for 20 years, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP. Still going strong here on this Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. And on today's daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, we're going to be like, Malik Willis wants how much money? And we'll also be saying goodbye to another Falcons / Kirktober legend in Cadero Hodge. We'll break down the top 11 or so cornerbacks into tiers and which of these guys we may be targeting for the Falcons on day 2 of this draft. But we'll continue starting off today's episode, gassing up Ian Cunningham. Yesterday, we talked about Ian Cunningham's straight talk about Kirk Cousins and Kyle Pitts. And we'll talk about his straight talk today about something that we briefly mentioned, but him talking about the Falcons will never just have 5 picks again, right? And it's worth discussing, breaking down his correct approach to the draft in contrast to his predecessor, Terry Fontenot's incorrect approach to the draft. And, you know, when we look at Terry's draft philosophy, and I've talked about this on the podcast, but, you know, I know not everybody listens to every episode, so we'll give it a brief overview. Terry's philosophy came from the Saints, right? Mickey Loomis, been the GM since like 2000, was there obviously during the Sean Payton, Drew Brees era. And their philosophy was much more of a conviction-based approach where, like, we know who's going to be good, and so we're going to go be aggressive and trade up and get our guys. And that philosophy, as I've explained, made sense in New Orleans, given the circumstances in New Orleans when you had Sean Payton, when you had Drew Brees, because what those two guys did was stabilize that organization. You had a high-performing quarterback, a Hall of Fame quarterback, right? As we just learned this past year, Drew Brees, a Hall of Fame quarterback. You have one of the best play callers in the NFL, and that gives you a stable foundation for your offense that we know drives team success in the NFL, that if you have a high-performing offense, you're generally going to win a lot more games in this league. And it really stabilized that team and really gave them a high floor. As we saw over the 15 years that they were together there, the Saints averaged 9 or 10 wins a season. And so they could consistently operate with the assumption, hey, we're going to win 9 or 10 games. We're going to make the playoffs most of the time. I think they made it like 11 out of those 15 years. And we need to take big swings in the draft and be aggressive and trade up and all that stuff, because if we hit on those home runs in the draft, that's going to take us from our 9 or 10 win floor to a 13 or 14 win ceiling. And now we're going to be in a position to win Super Bowls. And so that philosophy made sense for the Saints, and Terry Fontenot brought that same philosophy here to Atlanta, but he had none of the things that New Orleans had. He didn't have the high performing quarterback, right? 5 different week 1 starters for the Falcons across the 5 years that Terry Fontenot was. So you didn't have stability there. You didn't have the same stability when it came to the head coach and the play caller, right? And so that philosophy of we're going to take big swings, we're going to be aggressive, we're going to trade up, we're going to, believe in our conviction, just never really meshed. And it's why I sat here this past year basically saying, like, it doesn't matter that you can sit there and look at Terry Fontenot's successful drafting of 2025 players and look at his trade ups of James Pierce before his off-field incident and Xavier Watts and be like, oh, like he was right on that, right? It's just because he got good results, relatively speaking, doesn't mean and doesn't erase the fact that he had a bad process. And that process was not going to be sustainable here in Atlanta long term. It might have worked 1 out of 5 years, as we saw, but that was not something that you could build the next 5 years off of. And instead, you contrast that with Ian Cunningham, who has the very opposite approach. And basically his words are echoing this. And it's funny to me that, like, Ian Cunningham is using the exact verbiage that we're using, talking about at bats and swings at the plate and all that stuff, because that's where it really comes from. It tells you that he has that Ravens background. And anybody who knows me knows that I have a great deal of respect for Ozzie Newsome, here on this podcast, and Terry Fontenot gaslit me and the rest of us when he was like praising Ozzie Newsome in his introductory press conference so many years ago. I'm like, oh, Ozzie's a mentor. And it's like, okay, but Ozzie was more like a role model, not necessarily a mentor. Ozzie Newsome is legitimately a mentor for Ian Cunningham, and it's why we can be a lot more optimistic about the future of this football team, because Ian Cunningham's philosophy is that Ravens philosophy, which is what they figured out, that is a data-driven approach, right? And I say that data-driven because it is backed up by decades of data that basically says your ability to draft better than the team next to you or the team opposite you is not real. It's basically a crapshoot. And really what distinguishes the good drafting teams and the teams that are consistently successful in this league is not your ability to hit that home run when you step out to the plate. It's your ability to get more and more at bats. It's more of your ability, like, you're going to swing for the fences, but chances are you might hit a single, right? Or you may, try to, bunt or whatever, and somehow, some way, you wind up getting a triple or a double, right? That's the sort of random crapshoot that the NFL draft is. And so the more swings at the bat you get, the more at bats you get, the better you're going to be, right? And that's Ian Cunningham's philosophy. And I think that philosophy is going to help raise the floor for this Falcons football team as they try to figure out the coaching. Hopefully they've gotten their own Sean Payton with Kevin Stefanski and company. And then as we figure out the quarterback situation, hopefully we'll be talking about, Michael Penix, the new 9 as the old 9 in terms of Drew Brees, right? In the same light in the future, or they'll find somebody else who is that answer, and that will help stabilize this team. But it's one of those things where, like, this approach that Ian Cunningham is going to bring is, to me, the correct approach for this specific team that does not have the coach and the quarterback quite figured out yet at this point in time. And then if they do find out we do have it, then go and make the big swings when well, at worst, we're going to be a 9 or 10 win team and still win the division almost every single year, right? But until then, you got to kind of build up the floor a little bit. And I think this approach fits more with how I view the Falcons, with, not to say that the Falcons lack talent, but I think far too often under Terry Fontenot, they overestimated their talent. Again, to me, that's the core of Terry's failures, which is thinking like, we got all these things going for us, right? Like, they made big bets on, we got the best wide receiver duo in the NFL. They had one of the better ones in 2024. That's going to carry over in 2025. And Michael Penix is going to be a superstar in 2025. And those bets did not pay off at all this past season due to injuries and all that sort of stuff. And then what the Falcons were left with was, a good running game, a good defense, but like, that's basically an 8-9 team. And so, like, to me, they had no safety net because they did not necessarily get as many swings. Their depth was really undermined this past season in a major way, and it led to the downfall, I think, of this past season. And just to throw a couple of other stats at you, looked it up. Over the last 5 years, the Baltimore Ravens have selected 45 different players, right? 39 of those guys are still in the NFL. The Atlanta Falcons in that same period of time have selected 36 players, and 32 of those guys are still in the NFL. If you want to count Desmond Ridder, constantly bouncing off of different practice squads as the 32nd player. And so that percentage of players that you've drafted over the last 5 years that are still in the league is roughly the same. It's like 88%, 86% for both teams. But the difference is, because the Ravens have had 9 more picks than the Falcons in that span, they've had 7 more hits, and that's 7 more players that the Ravens have had to potentially shore up their roster and shore up some of these problematic areas. And that's, I think, going to be the approach that the Falcons are going to have under Ian Cunningham. And I think it's going to be hopefully a successful one. Obviously, we can talk all day about having a good process. You got it. It doesn't guarantee that you're going to get good results, but it does increase the odds that you're going to get better results if you have a good process. But ultimately they're going to have to hit on the draft pick. So we'll see if Ian Cunningham and company will hit on draft picks, but I'm very optimistic as we sit here today. And if you want to learn more about Ian Cunningham's Ravens based approach, Eric DeCosta, the Ravens general manager, had a very enlightening interview where he basically broke down the entire Ravens philosophy in like a 30-minute interview with Todd McShay last year at last year's combine. I believe it is up on YouTube. I'll try to remember to leave a link to it in the description below, as well as you can read the seminal draft paper that is kind of the guiding principle. And I believe Eric DeCosta mentioned it in that interview that I remember reading about 15 years ago, but I think it was written like 20 some odd years ago. It's called The Loser's Curse. It was written by 2 economists, Massey and Thaler. That's THALER. It should be freely available somewhere on the internet that you can read yourself if you want to get into the nitty gritty of why this approach makes sense and whatnot, if you want to enlighten yourself. But obviously that 30-minute DaCosta interview will do well. So if you just look up Loser's Curse and Massey, you'll be able to find it. But that's some light reading for you guys to do, some background research if you want to, as you try to understand Ian Cunningham's philosophy. And I think that will help enlighten you of why, this is such a good hire for the Atlanta Falcons. But we will move off of, gassing up Ian Cunningham on the podcast, and we'll talk about the cornerbacks. And, looking at some consensus rankings, breaking down these cornerbacks into tiers as we head into this combine testing that's coming up in the next few days, and sort of trying to circle a couple of guys that should be in the Falcons draft range on day 2 at the cornerback position. And we'll break down some of these guys, how their testing can maybe help them move up a tier or down a tier as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So we know the pressure is high in the NFL, but it is also high in your workplace, with deadlines overflowing inboxes in that one position that you have to fill sitting wide open, like Drake London on an option route. When the pressure is on, you need the right hire. Indeed is all you need. Indeed Sponsored Jobs is going to help you reach the right people who actually fit what you're looking for, with the right skills, experience, and location. So you're not just hoping that the right candidate stumbles across your post. Over the next minute that I'm talking to you, companies like yours will have made 27 hires on Indeed, according to Indeed data worldwide. So if you're hiring, spend less time searching and more time interviewing the candidates who check all your boxes with Indeed Sponsored Jobs. You can get a $75 sponsored job credit to help give your job that premium placement it deserves at Indeed.com/podcast. Just go to Indeed.com/podcast right now and support the show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. Now, it's a new year, and we all love to simplify in a new year. And one way you can do that is by, easy, reliable dinner plans. And that's why I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Home Chef. Home Chef is going to take the stress out of cooking by delivering fresh, fast, pre-proportioned ingredients right to your door with easy to follow recipes that actually taste great. They're rated #1 by users of other meal kits for quality, convenience, value, taste, and recipe ease. It's easy to see why, because the meals come ready to fit your schedule with a wide variety of options, from family-sized meals to quick lunches. And there's plenty of options for different dietary choices. Also, if you're looking to save time and money, Home Chef has got you. Customers can save an average of $86 per month on groceries. For a limited time, Home Chef is offering my listeners 50% off your first box, plus free shipping, plus free dessert for life. Just go to homechef.com/lockedon. That's homechef.com/lockedon for 50% off your first box, free shipping, and free dessert for life. You must be an active subscriber to receive that free dessert. So before we continue today's episode, I want to thank each and every one of you that are everydayers of this podcast. You are the reason why Locked On Podcast Network is the #1 sports podcast network in the Northern Hemisphere. And the offseason doesn't exist for the everydayer, especially if you're part of the Everydayer Club. Join the offseason discussion by talking Falcons all year round and get every episode ad-free at the link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. So, breaking down the cornerback tiers, my methodology, I looked at over a dozen draft boards, some of them being top 5 rankings, some of them being top 10 positional rankings, some of them being top 50 overall rankings, top 100 overall rankings, to sort of see how various people, people like the Daniel Jeremiahs, the Dane Brugers, the Mel Kipers, etc., how they stack the cornerback room. And sort of broke them down into tiers based off of sort of their average rankings in that. And, and for me, tier 1 was Mansoor Delane from LSU, Jermod McCoy of Tennessee. Then we had tier 1.5, and I'll explain where we get that tier, with AJ Terrell's little brother, Aveion Terrell out of Clemson. Tier 2 was Colton Hood out of Tennessee and Brandon Cisse out of South Carolina. Tier 3 is Chris Johnson of San Diego State and D'Angelo Pons of Indiana. Tier 4 is Keith Abney of Arizona State, Devin Moore of Florida, Keontae Scott of Miami, and Chandler Rivers of Duke. And so for me, when we break down these tiers, going through each one, tier one, right? Obviously the Falcons are not going to be in a conversation to get a tier one guy in all likelihood, unless, something crazy happens at the combine and someone really falls down the board. But, you got Delane and McCoy kind of jockeying for that CB1 position, and sort of the buzz around Delane is like he's not going to necessarily measure or test like an elite corner or anything like that, but he's got to hit like certain thresholds and benchmarks. And if he can solidify his spot as a CB1. The big concern with Jermod McCoy is he's coming off an injury that caused him to miss all of the 2025 season. So medical checks this week are going to be huge for him in determining where he is drafted potentially. And both of these guys in tier one are potentially top 10 picks, top 15 picks types of guys. Now, when we get to tier 1.5, that's again Aveion Terrell, AJ's little brother. And basically he's kind of stuck between tier 1 and tier 2 because he was like consistently like CB3 on a lot of people's rankings. But like he's not consistently ranked high enough to qualify for tier 1 with McCoy and Delane, who are consistently 1 and 2, jockeying for 1 and 2. And he's still slightly ahead of Hood and Cisse, who are consistently 4 and 5 on these rankings. And I think how he tests this week, he's not the biggest guy in the world, but if he tests like a plus athlete this weekend, I think that could potentially push him up, and we might be having a conversation with him being in tier 1, especially if the returns on Delane and McCoy aren't as glowing as people expect and whatnot. And so it'll be interesting to see where he if he pushes up into tier 1 or he drops down into tier 1. So that's why Aveion Terrell I have in tier 1.5. Hood and Cisse as tier 2 guys, typically over the last couple of years is usually 3 or 4 corners taken in the first round. So there's no guarantee that both of these guys will be first round, but these are kind of back end of the first type corners. This is guys similar sort of tier as like Maxwell Hairston, who went in the first round last year with Buffalo. Who was the guy? He just popped in my brain and I can't remember who it was. Another guy that was a late round. Oh, Nate Wiggins with the Ravens a couple of years ago, where it's like, I don't know if that guy's guaranteed to be a first round pick, but good chance if a cornerback needy team is picking late in the first round, those guys will go. But maybe one of those guys slides into round 2. Whether they slide far enough into round 2 to be in the range for the Falcons at pick 48 remains to be seen. And again, as we're talking about, we don't expect Ian Cunningham to try to trade up to 40 to get any of these guys because he doesn't necessarily believe in that. So we'll probably be looking at the Falcons looking more at tier 3 and 4, right? That's probably more likely to be who the types of players that they'll be targeting at pick 48. Chris Johnson was a guy at the Senior Bowl. I'll be curious to see how well he tests. The type of player that he reminds me of is kind of AJ Terrell. We'll see if he's as good an athlete as AJ Terrell. D'Angelo Pons out of Indiana is a smaller cornerback that a lot of people think is, played outside of Indiana, but might have to bump inside at nickel because of those size concerns. So measurables are going to definitely matter for him this weekend. Keith Abney is a guy that I haven't really watched. I don't know much about him other than he was a competitive roller skater when he was a teenager before he started playing football. So I'm expecting, that, I don't know how that translates from an athletic standpoint, but from what I've heard, like he should test pretty well this weekend as well. Devin Moore is probably the most intriguing guy on this list. I haven't really watched much of him yet because he pulled out of the Senior Bowl, and I was like, well, I don't have to watch that guy's film, and I haven't circled back to that. But he has size. He's supposed to be really athletic. The real big knock on Devin Moore out of Florida is his durability, right? He got hurt a lot in college, had a bunch of shoulder and back injuries. But if you've been listening to this podcast, you've been hearing me push about, the Falcons need another big corner opposite AJ Terrell. And it does seem like, Moore, that's why he's intriguing to me. And I'll be eager to see if we're talking about him a lot more. No pun intended, after the combine, because I did see in some of these consensus rankings as I was collecting these draft boards, a couple of people, not many, but a few had him in their top 5 cornerback rankings, which, at least in theory suggests that guy could potentially be a first round pick if there's a run on corners. And so I'm wondering if, he tests well and measures up well, as I think a lot of people expect him to. Will we start seeing more people pushing him into their top 5 cornerback rankings? But, medicals are also going to matter for him. Now, Chandler Rivers, another Senior Bowl guy. We talked about him being an outside corner that could play inside, smaller guy, but an actual good shrimp, right? We talked about, in contrast to the shrimps that the Falcons have been collecting over the years under Terry Fontenot, this is one of those gourmet shrimps, right? That Spanish red shrimp, that carabineros shrimp, if you know what I'm talking about. And we're big fans of Chandler Rivers, but we would prefer guys that are a little bit bigger than Chandler Rivers, but he's one of the good ones, right? We can sit here and say. And then Keontae Scott is another nickel guy, but unlike the other guys that are, potential nickel guys due to their lack of size, he's a nickel guy that has legit size. And, he's a very physical football player, very comfortable playing in the box. And it just goes back to a conversation we had earlier this week about D. Alford when we did a pass or pay on D. Alford. And we basically broke down that there was a high probability that there were going to be some quality nickels available in this day 2 range for the Falcons, and guys like Pons and Rivers and Scott kind of underline that point, and in theory could be picked as high as the Falcons pick at pick 48 or whatever. Now, if you're curious, why isn't this guy on the list? If we had done a tier 5, that's where guys like Davison Igbinosun out of Ohio State, Malik Muhammad out of Texas, Dalen Everett out of Georgia, Traden Stukes out of Arizona, those guys would have potentially been in tier 5. And those guys right now, I think just based off of the consensus rankings, are more projected to be 3rd and 4th round guys than, potentially top 50, second round guys at this point in time. But, if any of those guys blow up the combine this week, right, maybe they shoot up the rankings, and we're talking about those guys being in tier 4 or something like that. So when it comes to the cornerbacks, it's all about 40 speed. It's all about arm length, right? Because essentially at the end of the day, cornerback is a run and chase position, right? That's your job, is basically to chase that guy, right? And then tackle him if he gets the ball, right? And then that's where length matters, tackling. But more importantly, it's really going to, decrease your margin for error, basically, if that's the right phrasing, where if you have longer arms, you can close those windows by being able to reach out and break up those passes as you chase around that wide receiver, as well as it also helps you when it comes to being able to press guys at the line of scrimmage. Having that arm length is very beneficial there. So those are going to be the main things that we're going to be paying attention to with a lot of these guys. We want guys that are fast. We want guys that have long arms. We want guys that have those man cover traits, those athletic traits, as we've discussed before, where it does feel like the Falcons will be moving more in that man coverage direction to better match up with AJ Terrell across the field at that CB2 spot. We'll see if the Falcons look for a nickel as well in this draft, and that will also be important. So those are where we break down the cornerbacks. We'll see how the testing goes, but we'll wrap up today's episode talking about the loss of another legend, KhaDarel Hodge, as well as some buzz about what Malik Willis's contract demands could be as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So if you've ever wanted to experience the NBA Finals live and in person, FanDuel is going to give you the chance to turn that dream into a reality with their NBA Their NBA sweepstakes. Here's how it works. Use your profit boost on any NBA future, and you'll automatically be entered for a shot to win an NBA Finals trip for 2. That's right. Flights, tickets, the whole experience. And if you're looking at the board and you're thinking about some team that can make a deep run, this is the perfect time to lock it in. So I love futures this time of year, coming off the All-Star break, picking that team that can make a championship or conference title run. It's going to add an extra layer of excitement to every game down the stretch. And now not only can your pick win you some cash, it can also send you to the finals. Visit FanDuel.com to get started and use your profit boost on an NBA future to get entered for your chance to win a trip to the NBA Finals. Play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. So KhaDarel Hodge, reportedly from Jordan Schultz, one of the various NFL insiders and Starbucks boxing enthusiasts, reported that the Falcons have informed KhaDarel Hodge that he will be released. This is not a major surprise. I think we mentioned this on both our wide receiver breakdown in late January, as well as the special teams breakdown when we did our positional reviews of the 2025 season. That Hodge's release was a possibility. The Falcons will be saving about $2.6 million. He's just turned 31 last month. And this is a strong signal that the Falcons will be revamping their wide receiver room, much like they did in 2024 when they brought in Raheem Morris the first time. And we saw a similar thing happen in 2022. Wide receiver's been a problem area since they traded Julio Jones. I'm starting to realize that. It's like, it was a stable position for a long time with Julio Jones and Calvin Ridley and Mohamed Sanu and Harry Douglas and all those guys. And it's been very problematic It's like they just keep blowing it up every 2 years. Just start putting the two and two together. I wonder if those two things are related. But the question, of course, is going to be like, we know Drake London is going to be here. We don't really know who else is going to be here in this wide receiver room. And there's a good chance, I would say, that we get 4 new guys to go to tag team with Drake London to make up at least a 5-man room this upcoming season. And obviously, Cadero Hodge is not going to be one of those guys. We've always been a huge fans of Cadero Hodge on this podcast. I go back to 2022, and I remember after the Falcons made the trade to Bryan Edwards, like I tweeted out who I thought was going to be the 5 wide receivers that made the Falcons roster, and I had Cadero Hodge on that instead of Auden Tate. And I just remember so much of Falcons Twitter was like, "Oh, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about, and he's an idiot. And how could you have Cadero Hodge over Auden Tate? Do you know what you're talking about? You're an idiot. You're stupid. Blah blah blah." So if you want to understand where I come from and the pettiness that I have, it's just that basically underlines it, because Auden Tate never played another snap in the NFL after the Falcons cut him that summer. And Cadero Hodge obviously spent 4 years, been a Pro Bowl special teams player, one of the best special teams wide receivers in the NFL, over the last 4 seasons, if not the best. Certain metrics will say Ben Skoranek was the best, but if Hodge wasn't number 1, he was number 2 behind Skoranek. And last year really kind of boiled down to the Falcons' refusal to play Cadero Hodge. And, we saw him have a lot of success as the number 4 wide receiver in 2024, doing a lot of the same things that Ray-Ray McCloud did. And when the Falcons decided to part ways with Ray-Ray McCloud, a month into the season, it felt only natural that, okay, Cadero Hodge will be able to pick up some of the slack left by Ray-Ray McCloud. But the Falcons were like, no, we're not going to play with Cadero Hodge at all. And we're just going to trust in Casey Washington and David Sills. And to me, that was it's not the number 1 reason, but it was a big contributing factor to the downfall of the wide receiver position, which was a big contributing factor to the downfall of the offense in 2025. But, we are big fans of Cadero Hodge. We wish him the best, but we kind of figured that, the writing was on the wall when it came to this. Now, another thing that Jordan Schultz reported, he tweeted out earlier today that it's a foregone conclusion based off of the teams he's talking to that Malik Willis, an impending free agent and a player that we talked about the other day as a potentially, if the Falcons are shopping for that bucket number 1 brand new starting quarterback that's going to basically take Michael Penix's job, that Malik Willis was probably the guy that makes the most sense. But he said it was a foregone conclusion that teams expect Malik Willis to sign for a $30 million plus per year. And we'll see if that's the truth, right? Because, Jordan Schultz says, I don't think Jordan Schultz is a liar, but, yeah, it is what it is. But, he says teams are telling them that, but it's like, are teams telling you that, or is Malik Willis's agent telling you that? I forget who Malik Willis's agent is. Is it, it might be Mulugeta. I can't remember. I knew this in 2022, but I don't remember who it is now in 2026. But, you do just wonder a little bit, how true that is, right? It's like 30 million. It's like 20 million, sure. 25 million, sure. 30 million, foregone conclusion. Okay, we'll see. And I'm just curious because we were just talking about Malik Willis the other day on the podcast. So the question, of course, is like, is this too much money for Malik Willis? Is this just enough? Is this, the price of doing business of trying to make this potential upgrade at the quarterback position? I'm curious what you guys think when you hear Malik Willis at $30 million. Are you like, I'm out? I don't want any part of that. 20 million I was fine with, not worth that. Or are you like, look, man, we got to do what we got to do. And if we got to pay Malik Willis, Sam Darnold money or Baker Mayfield money, then we'll do that. But I don't necessarily, it is what it is. I don't really have a take. It's like, hey, Malik, if you can get that money, and if the Falcons going to pay you that money, hey, more power to you, my guy. As someone who, does not hate Kirk Cousins securing the bag here in Atlanta, I'm always about, players getting paid. So if you can, it ain't my money. That's what I always say. It ain't my money, guys. So if you can get Arthur Blank to write you a check for $30 million a year, by all means, more power to you. So that is going to do it for us here. We will talk more about, various positions. We'll probably get more into the D-line and linebacker groups tomorrow once they measure in. But we'll also, I think our next episode, before we get there, we'll be talking about, a linebacker that's on the trade block that Ian Cunningham is very familiar with in Chicago, and Tremaine Edmonds, and whether or not he's a viable trade candidate, or will the Falcons just kind of settle for drafting a linebacker. That will probably one of those linebackers we'll be talking about tomorrow on the podcast. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen by checking us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out Locked On NFL, Locked On NFL Draft, Locked On NFL Scouting to get the latest around the league and the scouting combine. And of course, if you never miss an episode, the Everydayer Club is built for you. Get Locked On Falcons ad free, plus members only Discord access, and so much more by heading to the link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. It is all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.